Global Transformation Astrology, GTA, with William Stickevers.
Now, let's talk about the Magi bearing gifts. So we know there were 3 gifts given to Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and all 3 were reserved for kings and deities because of their value. So these Magi came from a great distance, and they brought to Joseph and Mary enough gold that they could escape Herod and travel back to Egypt. So what we do know is the Magi didn't discover them in 3 BC. It looks like, based on the evidence, 2 BC, a year following, right? They then tracked down the family at that time. So this confirms, because what happens is Herod orders the murder of all boys up to the age of 2 years. Just before he croaks, one of the big last orders he gives is in accordance with the time that he learned from the Magi. So he doesn't hear back from the Magi. They never get back to him. They take off. They have a dream and they go, "Get out of here. Your lives are in danger. So you're not to bring back this information." And this was a 2-year period. From the time the Magi visit him in 3 BC, you have 2 BC, then you have 1 BC, and Herod realizes that his political future is in peril and that he's dying now. He's suffering from a number of major ailments, and his son, or his son's a successor, will be politically imperiled if this prophecy comes to pass. So we happen to know, right? This is the oldest image of a 3rd century AD sarcophagus slab that depicts the adoration of the Magi, the adoration of the astrologers. And what's interesting here is astrologers were the first one to recognize Jesus as the future king of the Jews, that has very spiritual, the question is, was he considered a divine being? According to the Bible, right? They kneeled down and worshiped him. But at the very least, he's recognized as someone who would become of great significance in the world, according to their understanding of prophecy and astrology. So it's the first people that recognize Jesus were astrologers, right? And, of course, the Catholic Church bans astrology, even though, Pope Leo X was one of the top astrologers in the medieval period, wrote 18 books on the subject. So I digress a bit, but I want to point out something here. It was the astrologers that not only funded the escape of the family to Egypt to protect them and gave them substantial amount of money. So they weren't broke, by the way. They had money. That money lasted a long time, probably throughout most of Jesus's youth. So they were not a poor family. And Mary, as we know, came from a royal branch of the line of David. So she was considered Jewish royalty. She wasn't a regular, girl next door from a modest means. So now, right, we have this list of events. We have Jesus's birth. I'm putting September 11th, but it's around that time. We will never be able to prove it out. It could be September 10th, September 11th, September 12th, but we know it's around that time based on the conception charts. And we see the following year, the Magi arrive bearing gifts. And according to tradition, apocryphal sources, that's December 25th, 2 BC. So he's a year old. He is called a young child, not a babe. So if you go back to the original Aramaic, the word they use is young child. So we know that occurred a year after his birth. Then Herod's death follows. Then Tiberius becomes the emperor of Rome in 14 AD. And we know Jesus begins his ministry in October 29 AD. And we happen to know the crucifixion and death, which occurs on April 3rd, 33 AD. And we know that is the time, but actually states it in the New Testament. During the time of an eclipse at 3 p.m., right, Christ dies on the cross. That pretty much occurs during this exact eclipse. Okay, so we have the timeline. Now we'll get into the celebration of Christmas. This is Jesus's timeline. This is the most accurate timeline. And of course, the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, right? And we see the near existential event. It's actually an existential event to Judaism. 80% of the Jewish population worldwide is killed, over 1 million people. The rest of them are dispersed, and Israel fragments into, it's no longer a viable vassal state any longer. Okay. Now that we got that. So what happens? Why don't we have September, right? It should be September. Pick a day in September. That should be the date. Well, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity's existence, Jesus's birth wasn't celebrated at all. The religion's most significant holidays were the Epiphany on January 6th, which commemorated the arrival of the Magi after Jesus's birth, and Easter, which celebrated Jesus's resurrection. So the first Christmas celebration by the early Christian church occurred on around 331 years after Christ's crucifixion in Jerusalem on April 3rd. So they had a good idea of when the crucifixion occurred, give or take a couple of years, and they had an idea when Pentecost occurred, but they didn't really know the year or the month or even the day of when Jesus was born. So, based on historical sources, in an old list of Roman bishops compiled in 354, these words appear for 336 AD, quote, 25th of December, Natus Christus in Bethlehem, Judea. Translation, December 25th, Christ born in Bethlehem, Judea. So that occurs in 336. The first Christmas celebration had occurred in Rome on December 25th, 336 AD, during the first Mass upon sunrise at 7:30 a.m. local time. In the first Christmas celebration event horoscope, what do we know? The placement of the moon in Pisces. And that is the Christian symbol for Christ, the symbol of the fish. And the 12 apostles were called the fishers of men, and the early Christians themselves were called little fishes. A code word for Jesus was the Greek word for fish, ichthus. So Pope Julius I, the bishop of Rome, there was no pope at that time, declared the nativity celebration of Christ on December 25th because it coincided with the existing pagan festival honoring Saturnalia, Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture. And that began several days before the winter solstice. So at this time, Christianity is considered a Jewish cult religion. And what happened was the emperor got so fed up with Judea because they kept trying to break from the Roman Republic and they had these revolts and they defied Herod's sons. He decides just to sack them all, destroy the temple. And of course, they're not considered Christians. They're considered terrorists. It's considered a cult terrorist group that's infiltrating throughout all of the empire, and they are to be executed once they're recognized that you practice Christianity. So they had to keep this secret. So the bishop of Rome, he says, well, if we celebrate Christ's birth on the 25th during the period of Saturnalia, we can disguise, we can do the celebration incognito. So you have to understand, we see the Christianization of the Roman Empire, which occurs about 300 years later. For that 300-year period, we see the Romans arrest, kill, torture, public executions. They do all sorts of things to destroy the religion. This religion is considered an existential threat to the power of Rome. So what happens is the more they do that, the more you suppress something, what happens? You all know what happens. It gets stronger, right? Now, while that's happening, during this 300-year suppression of Christianity, in 221 AD, we see the procession shift into the Age of Pisces. So that occurred within 40 years from the first celebration of Christmas. 40 years later, we see it shift from the Age of Aries into the Age of Pisces, which occurred in the 3rd century, 221 AD, which was the last year that the sun rose in the constellation of Aries in both the tropical and sidereal zodiacs at the spring equinox. And then what follows is the Edict of Milan, an agreement to treat Christians benevolently within the Roman Empire. That occurs about 100 years later. Note here, folks, Sun-Neptune conjunction, Neptune in Pisces, the symbol of Christianity. What does Neptune rule? Religious belief systems. Now, the religion itself is ruled by Jupiter, right? The religion in terms of the hierarchy and its impact on the secular world, but Neptune rules the actual belief system. So we're going to see a paradigm shift in belief systems. And then what happens? Shortly after the Edict of Milan, we have the Edict of Thessalonica, and it was issued on the 27th of February, 380, by Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius. And basically, he makes Catholicism of the Nicene Creed or Nicene Christians the state church of the Roman Empire. Look what happens, right? Christianity is spreading like a virus. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then what we see here is the first celebration, the first official celebration that's authenticated by the emperor himself. And what do we see? Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, triple conjunction occurs, and we see the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And so this Saturn, Jupiter, Neptune triple conjunction coincided with this profound historical transformation within the collective. This ushered in a new cultural worldview that set in motion the destruction of the old one. Sounds like what's happening today, right? During the Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, we see this alignment in the early 4th century. There was a changing of the gods. A powerful archetypal subterranean forces were unleashed that led to the destruction of the Roman Empire and the death of its gods. This is the complete collapse of not the empire just itself, but of all the different pagan religions, or all the different Roman gods, the Greek gods, all the different gods. This is the beginning of the end, or the collapse of paganism that dominated throughout the Roman Empire. And by the way, Rome had no problem with different religions. That's why it allowed for Judaism. They had no issues with Judaism. They had a problem with Judea breaking away from Rome, defying Rome, right? So what I'm getting at here is this is the collapse of all of these different types of belief systems. So we see this nascent underlying matrix emerging on the metaphysical beliefs and dogma of Christianity that offered spiritual comfort and the prospect of salvation. This concept, you can achieve salvation through accepting Christ. This is a very Saturn, Neptune, Pluto archetypal viewpoint, right? That you can receive salvation, the prospect of salvation decreed by the spiritual authority of the church. That's Saturn. You can see that Saturn, spiritual authority to achieve the spiritual comfort of achieving salvation would eclipse Roman authority and rule by the early 5th century. And the church becomes then what? The most powerful entity in the post-Roman Empire period.
To watch the full presentation and more like this on geopolitics, the economy, and world events from an archetypal and mundane astrological perspective, join the Global Transformation Astrology membership. Go to gta.williamstickevers.com. Become a GTA member today.